Hey, this is Dr. Hart, and in this video, I'm discussing the demographics of the United States Congress. One of the things that happened recently with Congress is that the demographics have changed in terms of shift from Caucasians to minorities. And this shift has actually been quite pronounced in recent years. And you can tell by this chart right here, where my red circle is, in terms of the total number of minorities currently in Congress, both the House and the Senate. And you will see that in terms of absolute numbers, the largest number is African Americans, which is 59. Next are Latinos or Hispanics with 46. And then you have Asian Americans at 7. And you have Native Americans at 6. So these are raw numbers, and this is for voting delegates only. So the 6 non-voting delegates in the House of Representatives are excluded. So these numbers are out of 535, 435 in the House and 100 in the Senate. So minorities overall are 23% in Congress as of 2021. Now, the second thing is the increase in the number of women in the United States Congress. So it says here, and again, if you haven't caught it yet, this is just Pew Research. So what we're having here is data from Pew Research. So the number of women is at a record where you have 27% of members across both chambers, the House and the Senate, are women. The next point that I have is that the number of millennials and Gen Xers in Congress has grown. Well, this hasn't shifted the overall age disparity between Congress and the average citizen. So if you recall, the average American is 38 years old, and in the House, the average age is 58, and in the Senate, 63. So the fact that you have more Gen Xers and more millennials in the current Congress than you had in the previous Congresses is simply because time passes and Gen Xers and millennials age, and so they get into the offices of power. But overall, this masks the fact that Congress outstrips the general public by one generation, and that people who occupy power in Congress, who hold this power in Congress, are in fact removed, not just by social class, but also by age from the average American, far removed. The share of immigrants has ticked up, and you can see it here in this chart where my red circle is. So currently, 3% of members of Congress across both chambers are immigrants. The population overall in America is 15% immigrants. So what happened over the last half century is an explosion of immigration led by Latin America and Asia, but obviously not exclusive to these parts of the world, but primarily Latin America and Asia. So in 1970, 5% of the US population were first-generation immigrants, and today it is 15%, but only 3% of members of Congress are immigrants. An all-time high that we see, well, of course, in the earliest Congresses, that's unfair, late 18th century. That's just the founding of the country. So, of course, there were a lot of immigrants. But in terms of the history of the United States post the initial Congress, you have a peak right after the Civil War in the late 1860s, early 1870s, when you have I would say almost 8% of members of Congress being immigrants. So the current point is nowhere near the historic highs. Okay, next point is that fewer members of Congress now have direct military experience, which is an understandable process of making the military service voluntary. So in 1972, the United States abolished the draft. And so since then, you can't be drafted, you can't be compelled to serve in the military. And the fact that fewer and fewer members of Congress have military experience is, of course, a natural uh, outcome of that. But there are also other factors. And I think another factor is that there's less of an expectation. Whereas in the past, military service was almost an expectation to occupy a very high office in the national government. Today, it isn't. It's definitely not just the abolition of the draft, but in general, it's the um, disappearance of that expectation. The vast majority of members of Congress have college degrees, not surprisingly. It's only a handful who actually do not. So we see here that by social class, they are removed because from the American people in general, because if you look at Americans 25 years or older, only about 30% have at least a bachelor's degree, but almost all oh, actually, here it says that 36% have a bachelor's degree, which I think is probably an overestimate. But still, this is much lower than, virtually everyone in Congress, like 94% of House members and all senators have a bachelor's degree or more education, usually more education. Usually they're lawyers or in some cases like veterinarians, like former senator from Nevada, John Ensign, and there are business people. But, the fact that you have 100% in the Senate and 94% in the House, many of them having more than bachelor's degree, many of them having gone to elite colleges, yeah, that does make them different from the average American. Number seven, Congress has become slightly more religiously diverse over time. Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of religiosity, there's been some, but not a very significant diversification. And, that is it as far as demographics. But most of you have probably known this already because in recent years, the American public has become familiar with a number of new minority representatives, like members of the so-called Squad in the House of Representatives. Probably most well known of them is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is in the news frequently, and even more frequently, she's discussed by various bloggers, and primarily, I would say, conservative and libertarian bloggers who sort of use her as the archetype of what they are opposed to. But this may just end up being positive publicity for her. And I don't know whether she will go higher and ever become a senator or even president, but I think it's possible because it seems like, the bloggers and the news media seem to be attracted to her, and she gets a lot of attention. And even though some of that attention is presented negatively, attention is a prerequisite for a higher office at this level. And so this is kind of a primer for the demographics of Congress. The last thing that I wanted to mention on this, most members of Congress are indeed millionaires. However, this is relatively new, and it's only been the case for a decade or so, since 2012. So most are in fact millionaires, but being a millionaire in the United States is not a big deal anymore, hasn't been a big deal for many years. The United States has a very, very large number of millionaires, probably somewhere between 15 and 18 million people. There are no billionaires in Congress. In contrast, there's approximately 700 billionaires in the United States. So none of the members of Congress would make the Fortune 500 richest people. They're just there are a few people who are truly rich. They're double-digit or triple-digit millionaires in Congress. But overall, while members of Congress are getting paid more than the average American, the average salary in Congress is $174,000, and that's for everybody except slightly higher for a few leadership positions. And yes, some members of Congress have made money in business or have inherited money or have investments that have grown enough to make them millionaires. The fact remains They are richer than the average American, but they're not obscenely rich, and none of them would. None of them come even close to being in the billionaire class. All right, thanks. I'll see you in the next one.